Good evening to everyone. Call February 5th, 2018 Mount Vernon Council meeting to order. Do have a one change to highlight on the agenda. We will be pulling J2 under the motion for approval, right under the consent agenda. We need to identify that prior to moving on to G2, so just FYI. Other than that, quick note of obviously Mother Nature's not playing nice today, so as I think everybody up here knows, I like to move fairly efficiently through the agenda, so I want to make sure we do that tonight so we can get those who have some travels, i.e. Chris and others, done at a decent time so they can head home. I know the roads are probably going to get worse before they get better. So with that said, I'll entertain a motion.
The motion to approve the agenda is presented.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item is communications. Is there anybody that would like to address the council? Seeing no one, we'll move forward. Next item, consent agenda. Item 1, approval of council minutes, January 15th, 2018. Item 2, approval of council minutes, January 22nd, 2018. Approval 3, approval of liquor license for Yacht's Landing. And item 4, approval of liquor license for Scores Bar and Grill. Entertain a motion.
I'd move passage of the consent agenda as presented.
I'll second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, as I mentioned, we'll be pulling that J2. Discussion and consideration of February 19, 2018 council meeting. Chris?
It's President's Day. Last 2 years we've moved it to either Tuesday or Wednesday. So
We're looking at January here.
Tuesday works for me, but Wednesday does not.
Tuesday does, Wednesday does not, that'll be said.
Correct.
Okay.
I think I'm the same too, which is good.
Gentlemen, what about you guys? Does the 20th work? Or somebody checks their phones?
Works for me.
Good evening.
All right, so I'll entertain a motion.
Move that we move the February 19th regularly scheduled council meeting to Tuesday, February 20th.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Right. Next item, ordinance 1-15-2018A, amending chapter 90.03, mandatory connections of the Mount Vernon Municipal Code. This is the second reading for this ordinance. Chris, anything to add, or anybody have questions?
yeah, just as my notes stated, Dave from B&K suggested that we add E, maintenance and inspection, to the ordinance. So I've included that with your copy. Should you choose to not include that language, then you would just approve the ordinance as written, or as approved in reading one, but.
So, just on a procedural note like that, we approve the first reading without this language. Is that?
You can approve all the way up to, you can change all the way
So
up
we
to the
could-
third.
Okay, and I don't know that, just in my experience on council, we've done that. Maybe it didn't.
No, typically we don't have to, but.
Yeah, okay.
So on that note, I did see two small things in section 1. There's a space missing, approved by the city council. And in item A, there's a typo. The type, capacity, location, construction, and layout of a proposed private on-site well system shall comply with all applicable cities instead of will. Other than that, I saw no changes.
Good catch.
Question or clarification on E with the new section that was added. What's the relative cost of a well inspection? I mean, is it, do you have any idea what that is? I mean, how much burden are we putting on it?
No, it's typically a water sample, and they'll send it off to a lab just for testing, but, hate to throw a number out there, but it's $100.
Okay, so it's not major. Okay.
No.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions for Chris? Otherwise, we'll entertain a motion.
I have some discussion points. I just thought it might be worthwhile for us to, well, I'll back up. So some of you have heard me say that I feel like when we're changing laws, we should be having a lot of discussion, especially motivation. You know, why are we doing this, pros and cons, all that kind of stuff. And I've advocated for work sessions to do that prior to having things brought in for first reading. So that's kind of 30,000 feet, and I still feel that way, and I don't think that happened for this. And so, you know, what that means is then I feel personally motivated to have that kind of discussion at the time of when first reading or now second reading is part of the agenda, without having a dedicated agenda item to really talk through why are we making this change, et cetera, pros and cons, bring in expert opinions, et cetera. But, so I thought I might first just ask what first precipitated our revisiting of this law?
As, well, I won't say as most laws, but it began situationally when we started looking at a property off of Country Club Drive. As we got further into the discussion of the construction or the use of wells in the community, the portion of section 1 under amendment where we have struck through that segment, that is the particular area of the ordinance that was originally adopted. Was a concern for me, especially when one of the council goals is to lay out an annexation plan for the south side of town. My concern is that with that language in there, we would have had to individually agreed or basically had annexation agreements with each individual property owner that had a well on their property already, because there was likely no way that the city's going to be able to get services to the homes that are located within the annexed area, to require them to start to amortize their wells out just for annexing in the city. Didn't seem like it made a lot of sense. So we started talking about that language. The second was, I did reach out to the previous city administrator and ask him what the origins or why we had originally looked at the ordinance adoption, if it had anything to do with wellhead protection of our own wells, or what the gist of the adopted ordinance was. And at that time, it was basically leapfrog development. There are easier ordinances to have in place to prevent leapfrog development than trying to ban well construction. I think what the ordinance in front of you does is at least give the city council at the time the ability to take a look at a proposed development with wells, should somebody want to move forward and do that. It doesn't open the door for anybody and everybody to bring a well in. You're correct, though, we did not have a work session. We had a discussion item on the council before this was brought forward.
So what I'm hearing is that there was a particular request brought to council that caused staff to review the law as it stands, and the law was found to be less than optimal in the general case.
Portions of the law, yes.
Okay. And so our motivation to modify it in the way that we're modifying it now is, how might we succinctly state what our motivation is?
I think the motivation is twofold. One is to make sure that our path forward for annexation does not require an...
Sorry. Trying to keep you verbal, sorry.
an undue heartache or issue with those that are being annexed in. The second is, at times, the economy of running a water or sewer line to a particular property for somebody that, for instance, there are portions of Mount Vernon that have areas that are, close to a quarter mile away that would absolutely make no sense for the city to run water or sewer to any of those locations, and the owners of the property can sign an agreement to put a well or sewer in, and then when a well or sewer gets close to them, then they would have to hook up. So I think the flexibility of allowing people to use their land in the meantime kind of takes the burden off the city to have to try and run $200,000 water lines to service one house.
But, so, I mean, just temporarily, why is it that we would want to change this law right now? What's our motivation to take action?
We do have an individual that has requested to do well and septic in the community.
Right.
And under the current writing, that wouldn't be allowed, is that the case?
Correct.
And so the motivation to deal with this right now is to create a pathway by which that current request can be considered.
Yes. Any person in the city of Mount Vernon can request that you review an ordinance.
Was the ordinance review requested?
Yes.
Oh, I thought the request was to have an exception or something like that. The request was that we review the ordinance.
No, I think if you talk to the applicant, he would just assume just for the allowance of wells, period. The additional language that you see in here is not to open Pandora's box and allow wells at any cost, so it's kind of a compromise.
Right, so we're taking it up because a citizen requested that we take up and review our ordinance.
Correct.
And do we have sort of like a pros and cons list around this? I mean, have we fully considered all angles on the change?
Well, I mean, we discussed it a little bit at a council meeting, so B&K Engineering has reviewed it, and some of the language, like I said, is part of this. But the attorneys have reviewed the language, and part of that is the only issue that, as we talked about wellhead protection, is if there were a wellhead protection area, then everybody, including Lynn County, would be a part of that. And there would be additional regulations to putting wells in. I think if you're looking at a potential detriment to this change would be, there's always, the more times you tap an aquifer, points of potential contamination are opened up. But the reality is anybody can open a well 5 feet on the other side of our city limits. So that's where I think when we originally started looking and talking about this had nothing to do with wellhead protection, which proceeded to call to the former administrator, trying to get a better handle on why they adopted it in the first place.
Okay, I just, did you receive something from our engineer other than their comments on the language of the ordinance? Did you receive an opinion on them regarding, different perspectives on the issue in its general sense?
Not specifically, no.
All right, well, I just, I'm feeling like this is the kind of thing where it's worthwhile to get a number of expert opinions, et cetera. That's just my personal perspective. Because I think that water is one of the most important issues that faces America, really. Because clean water is becoming more and more scarce. And so, that's, I have my feelings about a properly diligent procedure about changing or creating law, but also when the law is related to the resource of water, I think that it's extra important. Those are my personal feelings. And in the last meeting, I felt like there's no reason why we shouldn't exclude commercial uses, water uses in this ordinance. I didn't feel like having to support, but I maintain that position that I think commercial use should be explicitly excluded in the law.
Anything else?
Okay.
Anybody else have any?
Pardon my,
No?
my
Or sir?
extemporaneous speaking.
No? All good. Anybody else have any comments, questions? Otherwise, entertain a motion.
I would move the passage of the second reading of ordinance 1-15-2018A.
I'll second that.
Any comments? Roll call?
Weisler.
Yes.
Rose.
Yes.
Rodebush.
Yes.
West.
Yes.
Christensen.
No.
All right, moving forward. Next item, resolutions for approval. Resolution 2/5/2018A, approving the notice of proxy representation at the 2018 annual meetings of the members of the Lisbon Vernon Ambulance Service.
This is a resolution that we do every year. Those listed under B are our four representatives. And of course, it also states that Jules Scanlon will be the executive director. So nothing much has changed. Doug keeps City Hall in the loop as far as what's going on with the ambulance service. So if you have any questions?
Any questions? Otherwise, entertain a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve resolution 2-5-2018A.
I second.
Comments? No comments? Roll call? Sue?
West.
Yes.
Christensen.
Yes.
Rose.
Yes.
Rodebush.
Yes.
Weisler.
Yes.
Next item, resolution 2-5-2018, fixing a date for a public hearing on the proposal to enter into a development agreement with Midwest Development Company. Chris?
This is the final step in a rather long process. The development agreement that I provided is what you'll be considering at the public hearing. The only question at the public hearing, as I pointed out in my notes, will be Scotland has asked for a cap of $5,000 on the recuperation by the city for legal fees. The cost of going through this process is closer to $8,000 to $10,000, so I would prefer the cap be $8,000 versus $5,000. But again, we can talk about that at the public hearing.
So that's the only thing that we can discuss at the public hearing? or-
No, you can,
Oh, okay.
you can discuss the entire agreement.
Okay.
I was just pointing, that was kind of the last.
The last thing that we haven't really gone, okay, gotcha.
Yeah.
Kristen, the phases change on how this was going to be scoped out? I could have swore there was 5 phases to start out with, and I didn't think they were laid out like this. And that's not a huge issue, but I just wonder if there are any other changes besides that legal fee question.
No, well, so the phases themselves, from a development standpoint, were laid out during the subdivision process. Then they had to go back in and actually write legal descriptions for the potential phases as they collect monies. So they did a little bit more, I don't want to say an in-depth study, but they did a little bit more looking into as far as getting the $675,000 back, because it's broken up into these phases, making sure that the 10-year period for each of these phases would optimize the potential for them to recoup those funds. So there is a difference between the building phase map that was presented at the public hearings for the plating. It's fairly close. There were 5 phases. Phase 3 and 4 were actually, I think, broken into one phase, the smaller portions that were up there, but they're still working with those. So it could change again. Those changes, obviously, if there were anything significant, would have to come back to council and planning commission.
So this is the first time the council's been presented with this document as is, correct?
The development agreement, yes.
And what you're asking us for
You're
now
just setting the
is
date.
simply the date.
Yep.
That's why we had to pull that J2 up.
Yeah, okay.
I wanted to make sure
That's
that
pretty
you
quick in there.
had more than a week or weekend to review the document. I will say, though, this document has a lot of information brought to it from the Urban Renewal Plan Amendment, specifically for Spring Meadow Heights. So that document, you should, as far as the big numbers are concerned, come from that Urban Renewal Plan.
What would be the appropriate time for council to have a discussion about the specific details of this and provide feedback to staff?
The discussion either at the public hearing or after the public hearing before you vote on the development agreement.
Will the public hearing and the first reading occur at the same meeting?
It's not, it's just one reading. Just,
Will the public hearing and one reading be on the same meeting?
yes. Potentially. You can table, obviously, have discussion and still table as well. You're not forced to make a decision that night.
I was just gonna say, it feels like a lot. You know, to take in the content of a public hearing, weigh it all out, and do a document as large as this.
Yeah, and I think that's the reason, so, you know, that's the difficult part is procedurally, this is just the way they move forward. If you look at the urban renewal plan, if you happen to go back to the previous meetings, like I said, a lot of the information is transferred over from one document to the next. So in essence, we've been talking about the same information for, well, since at least October. The reason that, I would say this, most development agreements aren't more than about 10 pages long. The reason that this one is so long is because they individually had to break those phases up in order to allow each phase to have its own 10-year period. If they wouldn't have done it that way and just basically done a 10 to 15 page development agreement, that 10-year period starts from the time that the house is first built, and there's no way that they would have been able to recreate. Obviously, they weren't going to build 150 homes in 1 or 2 years. So that's what made this development agreement, and even the next one that you would consider for Stonebrook the same. They're just going to be extremely long because of the phasing.
But in that format, would a lot of the, aside from the numbers in each phase, most of the information would be, it's going to be a template, right?
You have a lot of similarity.
Yeah.
There are specific areas, like I said, the dollar amounts are going to differ. But really that's
And maybe the style of housing within each phase.
going to be the most significant. And even, I mean, the explanation of the style of housing is, but the dollar amount is the biggest thing in what it's being recuperated for. So, yeah, I would say each of the agreements are going to be equally as long.
Has Parks and Rec provided an opinion on the parkland contributions that are assumed to be included in this?
They did as part of the subdivision review.
Has council received the content of their analysis and recommendations for the use of that park?
Not in writing.
I bring that up because there's another agenda item related to the purchase of some of the land within this area, and so, it'd be nice, as a council member, I feel some need to have information about the intended use of the open parkland that appears to be dedicated within this development area.
So their desire is to basically create a neighborhood park, meaning we classify parks similar to neighborhoods in that we have neighborhood parks on a much smaller scale that are designed specifically kind of for that neighborhood, and then we have destination. I don't even know exact terminology for the larger parks, but Elliott would be considered more than just a neighborhood park because it's serving a larger purpose. Bryant serves kind of a combination of both because we do have activities going on there, but Elliott Park is by far our largest, probably destination parkland space that we have. The rest of them that you'll see, because of the parkland dedication ordinance or requirements that we're allowed to put in by law, depending on the size of development, really kind of garner closer to what a neighborhood park would be. The trail locations that are part of the plating and then this agreement were reviewed by the park board at that time, just to make sure that we had connectivity. Some of the other green space obviously is for stormwater related stuff, but I can talk more about Elliott when we get to that agenda item if you'd like.
Yeah, I was just curious to what extent the council's opinion about accepting the agreement as a whole should include their understanding of the Park and Rec Board's intended use, and perhaps even seeing their specific report and plan related to the parkland donated within the context of the agreement.
I think that would be helpful. It would be helpful to see what considerations were put into it.
There is actually something in writing, Chris, but
I don't know if you guys ever put anything in writing?
As far as the perk, what we're going to utilize the land for?
Yeah.
Yeah, we did. We had conversations during the subdivision review process. Park and Rec Board had an opportunity to weigh in, put in writing that they approved the use of the land. The Elliott Park land, the section between the railroad tracks and what we're acquiring, we're actually going to take our soccer fields that we utilize baseball fields right now on, the outfields of baseball fields, and move those to the soccer, to what we call the soccer fields. So it really is a huge asset to our department, because right now, what I'm doing this spring, because our baseball programs are growing so large, I'm taking our youth soccer programs that are right now going on outfields of baseball and moving them to the inside of the track at the high school, because I just don't have enough space for all of these activities. And I'm hoping that'll give me a buffer of 1 or 2 years, maybe even 3, before we move over to the Elliott Park section, if that's an option. So we're looking at alternatives right now for some of our programming because of space and utilization of certain types of fields. The 2 ball fields that we use are very small, but yet they house 4 soccer fields for the younger age groups. And so there's probably, in any hour, there's probably 50 to 60 kids and parents running around on these fields themselves. So it's really a space that we are going to utilize in that way. So that was our intent, was not to put a bunch of fancy equipment up there, but just get it graded, and the approach was going to be graded 2 tiers, so 1 tier would be a little higher than the other because of the way that ground is. And parking would be on both sides of the sections, and it would be very minimal parking available because there's a parking lot on the south side already of that park. So hopefully that answers that question. With the neighborhood park inside of the development, we were just looking at just a simple neighborhood park, probably some playground equipment, simple playground equipment, but not being a destination park where it would be people bringing their kids up for practices, dropping them off, leaving. It would be just more, we felt that it was such enclosed by all of those homes that it would be very appropriate for just a neighborhood park for those neighbors and those homes to enjoy.
So Matt, there are 2 areas on the map of the proposed development labeled parkland. A small one closer to the center, and then a large rectangle at the top with a long triangle that extends down towards the south. Can you describe the purposes from the Park and Rec Board's plan for each of those 2 parts of the parkland that are shown in this diagram?
So if I think you're talking about I didn't bring my map up with me, I think you're talking about the long rectangular section within the neighborhood? Is that correct? Is that what you're talking about?
There is a small rectangle, almost 2/3 of the way from the midpoint north to south.
Is it to the east?
It's nearly in the center. It's just off center, and it's a small rectangle wider than it is tall, labeled parkland.
if you want to come look at it, man.
Yeah.
And then at the top is a large rectangle at the northernmost part of the property. It has a triangle that extends down from the corner.
Parkland right in the center.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so that small little section there is going to be more just generalized green space. Again, we utilize as open space. It won't be anything programmed or planned there because it butts up with the water retention area, which is going to be sort of where that triangle is. towards the parkland. So in between that jagged triangle and the parkland, that's water retention in there.
And so the parkland that's labeled here to the north is intended to be used for soccer fields?
Correct.
Is that what you just said?
Correct, yes, that is correct. And sorry, the other space I was referring to is going to be in phase, I think it's in between phase 3 and phase 4 here. It's not labeled parkland.
It's on the previous page,
Okay.
the one that's
Oh, okay.
within the house.
Yeah, the one within the housing developments. That one's going to be the neighborhood park.
The lawn strip.
The long,
In the yellow.
in the orangish yellow,
Orange,
yeah,
yeah.
that's correct.
Gotcha.
And that'll have a trail running through it. Also, the section to the north will have a trail connecting to a proposed trail that we'll talk about a little later on. That we talked about at the last budget, work session.
It's labeled as lot G or something like
Have you established budget or cost estimates for any improvements to these three different parkland areas?
Well, the top parkland area was about 20 to 25,000 as far as for grading is concerned. So the northern section. to get
For the
that-
soccer fields?
For the soccer fields, yes. For the neighborhood park area, again, the trail is being provided by the developer for that area, so that's not going to be a cost associated with us. $20,000 to $30,000 for playground equipment, but since that's that's phase 3, I think, so that we haven't really even considered that on their plan.
Right.
that. And that's why the grading was pulled off the budget, because it's not gonna happen
Well, we don't have a funding
Well,
source for it at this point.
Not yet, we don't have a funding source for it.
All right.
I think to answer your question
Does that help?
though,
It is very helpful.
if you go,
Matthew,
Pardon?
thank you.
You're welcome.
for, yeah.
if you look back at the way our ordinance is put in as far as the subdivision, most of that discussion happened back during the planning process. So we have every individual or company that wants to plat in the community has to have a sit-down with the engineer, the attorney, staff, planning commission, mayor. Everybody's invited to sit down and have that discussion. A letter report is done by my office, that goes to the planning commission, who then in turns forwards that information on to the city council. All of that information came during the platting procedure, with the exception of what was specifically going to go in the parkland. The only issue that I would say about the parkland right now is, it just kind of depends on when those portions actually get platted, as far as when they get dedicated and when we actually have to do anything with them.
And one last question, and this is just because I think it's important for all council to know this, and they, having not been through a bunch of these, they may not have heard, but what percentage of the land to be developed is required to donate, or for which they provide a cash flow?
5%?
5%.
5%.
Thank you.
Was that city ordinance or is that state?
It's
That's
subdivision ordinance.
It is kind of the statewide norm.
Okay.
West Des Moines was actually taken to court over their parkland dedication, and 5% was kind of what was agreed upon.
Basis for, okay, thank you.
Yeah, something
If I
else?
may add, yeah, just real quick, as a quick note, I forgot, the little section of the parkland that I talked about was just south of the water retention. That's going to be a trailhead section, because the two trails, the ones goes east-west and north-south, are going to connect there. So that was another reason why we looked at parkland as an opportunity there.
Good, good.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.
Are we on big questions? Anything else? Otherwise,
On that note, I would move that we set a public hearing date for the next regularly scheduled city council meeting, which is now the 20th of February.
Second.
comments? Otherwise, roll call?
Rose,
Yes.
Weisler,
Yes.
West,
Yes,
Christensen,
Yes.
Roundbush.
Yes.
All right, next item, old business, which we need a motion to remove from the table, so to speak.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Discussion and consideration of establishing a poet laureate for the city of Mount Vernon. Mr. Maravich, please address the council, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. First of all, I'd like to extend my appreciation for tabling this. We were having some internal discussions that weren't wrapped up. I think we're all on the same page now. So, my name is Steve Martz. I'm the president of the Mount Vernon Area Arts Council. I've been on the Arts Council for 8 years now. And during that time, periodically, we do a lot of visual art in town, we do music in town, but periodically people have brought up, what can we do about the written word kind of thing? And we've had discussions over the years about a poetry slam or something like that. But I was talking with Professor Glenn Freeman, who is at Cornell College, a full professor up there. And we came up with the idea of a poet laureate. And we did a little bit of research on this. And right now, the largest city entity in the country that has one is in Vermont, and it's about twice the size of Mount Vernon. And so that's a little added bonus that we think it could be a little bit of a cachet that we could have. But to sum up our thinking, I mean, it's really we're known as a town with art people, and we like to celebrate the arts, as you can tell by a lot of our town celebrations. And we would like to propose, the Arts Council would like to propose, that we establish the position of Poet Laureate at Mount Vernon. The Arts Council is prepared to fund this position, a stipend of $500 a year. We'd like to request a 2-year period so that we can pull the plug if it's not working out. We don't foresee that being a problem, but we just want to give ourselves an escape hatch on the thing. The criteria are in the materials, I think, that you've got in your packet there. The selection committee, should this be approved by the council, would be Glenn Freeman, professor of English at Cornell and a published poet, Amy White, who is the librarian at the Lisbon Library, but a resident of Mount Vernon, and myself. And I think that I included the criteria for the selection in there. We don't see this as being any kind of a frivolous thing. We have a number of published, really very erudite poets in this town, and we would be glad to have any one of those as representing us as Poet Laureate. The commitment would include 2 things. This is in our draft proposal, one of which is that we would ask the Poet Laureate to make appropriate remarks, original remarks, at the Memorial Day celebration at Mount Vernon Cemetery. I have not talked to the organizers of that yet, and that would be my next step upon approval. And then we would also ask that they would come up with some kind of an outreach activity, either for school kids or for adults in town, and they would have access to applying for funds from the Mount Vernon Area Arts Council. We have a small grant program that people can ask for grants in the hundreds of dollars and things like that. So, do you have any questions?
Any questions for Steve?
I think Mike Woods is the person you want to get in touch with for the Memorial Day program from the VFW American Legion side.
Okay, I know.
What would be the appropriate mechanism by which city council could establish such a thing? Any sense, Chris?
Most likely, because it would be kind of an appointed official, that you could create a poet laureate by resolution.
I was guessing.
We do have one request, and that would be that the Poet Laureate be listed on the city website.
Is it possible that we might look for what other cities have done to establish such a thing and then follow their example?
Possibly, but I don't know of anybody in Iowa, because I've asked, that has one.
We may have to look further.
Yeah.
Vermont.
Frankly, that's what I love about the idea.
You said the largest was in Vermont, but I think you meant the smallest. Is that right?
I'm sorry, right, the small.
Yeah, so there are probably lots of larger cities that have done so, and probably not too hard to find something in there, potentially in their code of ordinances, but more likely to be done by resolution. Right? But maybe we could contact somebody from those entities and inquire. Or we could just Wild West and just do something that seems good. But I personally support this and would love to request of staff that they look into creating such a resolution or appropriate method to make it efficient.
Kind of a good cultural fit. When I first moved to town, I think Robert Dana, I think was the state laureate, and lived on the south side, southwest side, if I remember correctly, for a long time. So we've got some significance there, and it just fits in with our culture. I mean, there's past councils that approved the planet plaques, you know, from downtown all the way out. And does that make any money? No, but it's kind of neat and it's kind of creative. It's unique to Mount Vernon, and now it's there for decades. So.
I liken it to the sledding hill.
But you know, same
Who
type of
else
cultural
does
thing.
this?
Yeah.
It's attention getting and it's creative.
We think it's a cool thing,
Yep,
Yeah.
I agree.
and we're a cool town.
My only thought in reading about the qualifications is that I hope that the way that you've written it doesn't prevent students from pursuing it. Because I think that they should be able to be considered if they're a serious student of the arts, whether they're a high school student or a Cornell student. I think it should just be open to them as well.
Yeah, I agree. And we are, Professor Freeman and I got into a sort of convoluted discussion, as many of my conversations are, about the definition of poetry, and we will define it as broadly as possible. So, for
Yeah,
example,
and I think having had their work published is probably going to need to be defined. You know, does the high school yearbook count? Or,
Yes.
you know,
We're
It would.
digital.
yeah, we're digital. So,
or a literary magazine out of college or something like
right, that could be broader.
Any other
Thank you.
questions for Steve? Thank you very much, sir.
that. Okay, thanks very much, appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Next item, motion for approval, consideration of claims list. Any questions? I have that in front of us. Everyone, so we have a motion.
I would move approval of the claims list as presented.
I have a question.
I'll second for the question.
Okay, just for my purposes, U.S. Bank credit card purchases on that list, what bucket does that go into?
Each-
Because that can be pretty broad.
So each credit card is, well, so each department basically has a credit card that's monitored by City Hall. Each department head can choose to carry, I carry, fire chief carries, it depends on how often they travel, but they're mainly used for travel and then local purchases. And then where the purchases come from, they fill out a request for each of their department heads, and then there's a claim that goes along with it. So they'll come out of all of the department's budgets.
Departmental budget?
Yep.
Ready for examples, Scott? Other than travel?
Well, I just noticed that, you know, most of the other line items are broken down to specific department and what they were used for, and that was one that isn't, so I was curious to know.
Yeah, so if you look at just be the way that US Bank bills,
Mhm.
but there's an itemized list of each one.
And then those get billed to each department.
Correct.
Expense reports filled out.
Okay.
Does that help?
Yep, that helps. Thanks.
So we have a first and a second, correct? Yep. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. Item 2, we talked about earlier. Item 3, discussion and consideration of setting a public hearing date for March 5th, 2018 to consider the City of Mount Vernon fiscal year 2018-2019 proposed budget.
Basically, all I need to know if you're okay with the levy rate staying the same. Once it's published, you can go down, you just can't go up.
Entertain a motion for the March 5th Any questions?
I make a motion for the March 15th date for the adopt the budget and certify the levy rate.
For clarification, it's March 5th.
Oh.
Meeting for IE.
Okay,
We have to have it
March 5th.
certified by the 15th.
The hearing needs to be on the 5th.
March 5th, yes.
Yeah.
And the March 5th, is the normal council.
I would second that motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries for the 5th. Next item, Big Brady writes his stuff. Discussion and consideration of setting a public hearing date for an ordinance amending and correcting ordinance 11-6-2017A for providing that general property tax is levied and collected each year on all property located within the amended Mount Vernon urban renewal area in the city of Mount Vernon, county of Lynn, state of Iowa, by the benefits of the state of Iowa, city of Mount Vernon, county of Lynn, Mount Vernon Community School District, and other taxing districts, be paid to a special fund for payment of principal and interest on loans, monies advanced to the indebtedness, including bonds issued or to be issued, incurred by the city in connection with the amended Mount Vernon urban renewal area. Amendment number 5 to the Mount Vernon urban renewal plan. Chris?
Basically, you're setting another public hearing date. Let me just say that for another ordinance. The other information that you have with you, so this is again for Spring Meadow Heights. When the ordinance was passed, there was a legal description request made by Lynn County. That information was handed to you the night of the meeting when we started this process. However, when it was actually recorded, the original document got recorded instead of the new one. Since there's no evidence outside of the video showing me handing you those, the attorney has asked that we just go ahead and adopt this ordinance. So that's really what this ordinance is doing, nothing that you haven't already approved.
Just making
Just
it
has
official.
a slightly different description.
So you just need a motion saying what exactly?
Setting date.
So I'd move that we set a public hearing for the next regularly scheduled city council meeting, February 20th, to revisit ordinance 11-6-2017A.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. Next item, discussion and consideration of land purchase for an extension of Elliott Park.
So again, during the planning process and before I came, just to give you a brief history, the city had entertained buying a portion of that space for park and the extension of Elliott Park from the landowners at the time. I think it was decided not to pursue the purchase because of the cost. When Skogman entered the equation and talked about potential parkland, they had laid out that elongated park in the center, which would be the neighborhood park. At the time, we also discussed the potential to purchase additional ground from them as an extension of Elliott Park. They really haven't changed their individual requests. They said you can buy that ground at the same cost that we purchased the ground from. So that purchase price was $17,500. If you would like to see the actual affidavit, I can provide that as well, but that was what they bought the ground for. Attempted to do, or what I would entertain with the council in order to buy down the cost, there is a stub street that was of Davis, basically, that was to go to Lisbon, butt up against the Lisbon city limits. There really is no indication that that's going to develop anytime soon. We got into the conversation at staff on whether or not it was a good idea to go ahead and pave that small, basically half-block portion of Davis Drive and let it sit until Lisbon decided to develop. That's when I, asked Skogman if they would reduce the price or the cost of purchasing Elliott Park by whatever the cost of that stub would be, because it's technically their responsibility right now to put that stub in. So, as a council, you have the ability to waive that installation. There's an estimate of $22,000 to $23,500 basically for that stub. If you removed that portion, the cost of purchasing that portion, that extra 5 acres of Elliott Park would be just under $75,000, or about $13,780 per acre. As Matt stated, we're struggling with ground for soccer. Outside of Elliott, we have Davis and Bryant. Those are really the largest parks that we have. Stonebrook did set aside ground outside of, obviously, the first subdivision that's part of the new Stonebrook subdivision, along with some other green space. But that's about it. So probably is not going to be any easier time to purchase additional ground there.
The stuff that you're talking about, if we go back to whatever the agenda item was for the,
Where the map is.
yeah, thank you. Exactly which one are we talking about? Is it the one that runs just to the south of the proposed parkland?
So what would we be purchasing?
No,
Oh, the stub of Davis?
The stub, yeah, like what are we?
There's
talking
a
about?
small, so if you look at Davis Drive, kind of follow along with Davis Drive, there's a small,
Where is Davis Drive?
Davis Drive is not labeled in the picture that we have in our packet, I don't think.
that would be
Is it
beneficial.
roughly in the center?
It's the middle road.
Yes.
So that runs like in between the orange and the blue?
Correct.
Okay.
It's basically that little
That
stub there.
divider, okay.
Yep.
So
The
then-
two that are on the northernmost portions,
Mhm.
there really isn't much of a stub there because there's a back alley basically that will connect those two.
Okay.
So that stub is the one that, again, is right now technically the responsibility of the developers to put in. But as we've talked internally, having concrete sit out there being unused and just sitting there for a number of years isn't going to do us a whole lot of good. And even though we've left the right of way, there is no agreement between us and the city of Lisbon that they would actually tie in to that drive. So
Just
we're assuming that we would, and we want to obviously make sure on our end that we leave that open, but there's no formal agreement.
Would we not want to reach that agreement prior to the whole planning process, just to make sure that our streets are...
Now, I mean, from our perspective as a city, it's sound planning practice to continue that. The right-of-way being large enough, should they decide not to in the future, should Lisbon decide not to, I guess, does lend itself to other uses.
Such as?
It's actually a buildable lot. Could be a buildable lot. Should, yes, 60 feet wide is the minimum.
So if we don't build that one lot deep deal, it would just be green space, basically? Okay. And then if we think 15 years down the road and Lisbon does develop over there?
Then it would be the responsibility of the city to put that
Okay.
stuff in.
Right, okay.
So you're basically reducing Skogman's cost now to reduce the cost of the ground and the out-of-pocket out of the city's hands by relinquishing their responsibility to put that in.
Is the, what was the number, 22 something, 25?
The 22707 is what Hall & Hall Engineers has put together for a cost estimate. B&K I had review, and it's definitely in the ballpark. If the city were to do it, it's going to be slightly higher just because of our bidding responsibilities, so
Does that number include not only paving, but also
water and sewer.
everything that we would have put underneath if we were doing it? Okay.
So, and Has Parks and Rec made this recommendation in any kind of official way for this purchase of Elliott Park?
During the plating procedures, they did.
Outside of the context of the plating meeting?
Yeah, it is also part of the master parks plan
Okay.
to add additional parkland to the north and to the east.
Great, that's what I was looking
Yep.
for. Thank you. And in terms of the timing of this, well, first of all, does the development agreement established with this developer address, mention, have any kind of included contingencies or dependencies upon this purchase of the Elliott extension?
No, if we choose not to purchase it, then they will probably come back to you and plat it for buildable lots.
And so do you think that there's any strategic nature around the timing of us making this purchase? You know, is it going to be serving them a great advantage if we do it sooner rather than later?
No, it's actually serving us as an advantage because the cost of potentially, when we get to that point in the budget, talking about doing the dirt work out there, we will not get it done any cheaper than what could be done right now with their contractor that's there.
Right, and do you have a full cost estimate to get it from bare ground as it is into soccer fields to play on?
Yeah, we do. That was what was on.
That's in the CIP.
Mhm. In the CIP.
The CIP, the 20,000 that is in there is basically for the dirt work, not for playing surface.
All the
per
way
se.
ahead.
We're assuming that 20,000 is basically what the two engineers have said that should be a solid number as far as earthwork. We have not reached out to Scobin's contractor yet. I didn't want to get ahead of ourselves of whether or not we were even interested in purchasing the property first, but
So the 20,000 just two tiers it.
right now with the estimate would get us the dirt work that needed to be done.
Gotcha.
The
Making
grading,
it flat and getting topsoil on top of it?
correct.
Okay. Then we would need to do
Seeding,
seeding,
Okay.
grass and whatnot.
Some of them we can handle in-house, right?
potentially, yeah. I mean, we do have a hydro seeder and Nick will probably
We gotta
shoot
leave
arrows
that.
through me right now, but
Pretty solid.
I'm trying to get a read on the other poker face right now.
Would there be any need for drainage tile or any other kind of improvements?
there are, where the two tiers meet, depending on how we decide the final design to be, if typically where it starts to fall off, if there's any trenching that needs to be done to keep the two surfaces fairly dry, then the tile would be in those locations. As far as tiling underneath the fields, no. The goal being, obviously, for these to be parks and recreation, soccer fields, and not what I'll consider high school level, where we're irrigating and tiling, similar to what Cornell is doing.
But you've given consideration to if we build it up with the tiering, how it's going to affect the properties
So
to be
the
built around it?
portion, if you looked at that map, the portion that you see that's kind of shaded out is a detention basin.
Okay.
So any water that would be coming from that Elliott Park would go to that detention basin. The best part about what I can tell you right now is that being a farm field, the runoff is actually higher than what it would be if it were all seeded over in grass. So the obvious way seeding it is some of the runoff would be encapsulated with the surfacing.
So if I'm looking at this map, because I'm awful with directions and orienting myself, we've got railroad track runs at the top of it, you've got the potential soccer fields there. Is Elliott kind of over in this chunk?
To the left.
This is what.
So if you're
that's
looking
right. So
at
that's
this right now,
Yeah,
Yeah.
here's Elliott
okay,
and here's the park.
and that's what, right, okay.
Yep.
So it connects right to it.
This white,
Gotcha.
not hashed out area
Yeah.
is the detention basin.
Okay,
Now that basin will likely stay dry a majority of the time and
Right.
be utilized
Could be fields.
as well, but keep in mind that, and wet
Whatever
horse
it
is
is.
gonna be unusable.
okay. Thank you.
So I want to understand the funding. I can't remember how it's worded on this, but,
Borrowing from a proprietary fund.
yeah.
So specifically, one of our utilities that is doing well,
Yes.
sewer and water, not storm water.
No.
Not for a while.
Hard to borrow from a negative.
It's American life.
So the council can actually borrow from itself internally. It can charge itself interest if it would like. You can take from another fund that is allowed, general fund, franchise fee, whatever you would like, that could be utilized for a park. And in the future, pay yourself back. You can choose basically not to pay yourself back. It's really up to you.
But fund, oh, go ahead, sorry.
No, I was just gonna say, park plan purchases are a tricky one, because there's just not a lot of funding mechanisms outside of the general fund that we can utilize.
Does all that need to be identified in the motion or no?
No, I really need to know if you're agreeable to the terms before I kind of put a purchase agreement together, and then when we put a purchase agreement together, then I would identify which fund we would. I will tell you likely sewer.
Even if we were to do that, we study above reserves. that we
Correct.
designate,
Yeah, all that kind of
Yes.
stuff. That was healthy.
Yep.
Any other questions?
I'd move forward with the land purchase extension of Elliott Park as outlined in the memo.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Matt, thanks you.
I thank you.
Next item, discussion budget.
So I've sent my budget memo out, and I've sent basically the capital improvement plan for fiscal year 19 with a whole lot of red on it. Just basically my notes as what my thought process are for moving or moving items and moving them down under cuts, the funding mechanisms for those that remained in the budget. But to start, I just kind of wanted to go through my memo, and last year I did this as well. I've gone through and provided you with explanations to just about every increase or decrease on a major level. Those increases that were like a couple $100 are just kind of left for your own ability to peruse through that. But I more or less wanted to kind of just walk through each of these sections and see if you had questions specifically for them. On that front page again, the items that you see there, historic preservation all the way through planning and zoning, asked for no increases, so they stayed the same. The next line items, Heritage Days actually decreased. They had decreased the year prior to this. They'd only asked for the $1,500 for the fireworks, but they asked for $1,500 for, or not $1,500, they asked for police services in kind. So we left $1,500 in there in case we needed to make an adjustment. Doug did a good enough job last year that we don't expect to that $1,500 to be needed, so we can reduce the $1,500. Veterans Memorial, I believe the mayor received an email verification that they're not requesting any additional funding, so that $5,000 has gone back. Cable TV, again, we just kind of continue to make adjustments based upon membership or users.
Explain that to me. What do you mean?
We get franchise fee
Oh.
related money based on their users, but they won't tell us how many users they have, and they don't have to.
Very protective of it.
Yes.
Okay.
Building inspections, this is a $30,000 increase, but it's also a pass-through. So those $30,000 increase is actually coming through in fees. The major increase is we believe we're obviously going to see some housing construction, and the basic house is about $1,000 worth of permit fees. So again, it's just a pass-through. It's not money that the city actually had a budget for. It's just kind of coming through and going to Lynn County. The library,
Just out of curiosity, then I apologize. For the building inspection, it's a pass-through in that they write the check to us and then we write a check to Lynn County.
correct.
But we still have to, it takes staff time.
We have a small administrative fee in there for our zoning.
Okay. So we've got some, just because we have to do it.
Yeah.
Deal. Okay, thank you.
Library, this is twofold. One, their librarian or their assistant librarian has gotten her degree and they're trying to keep her, bringing her salary a little bit more in line with what her counterparts would be. The second is the new director of library services for Cornell has looked at their budget a little closer, and the interlibrary fund system, they have to pay for that, and so he's basically just broken that into percentages of usership, so they're able to track where those books are going or those requests are coming from. So he's asked that we pay our portion for the city request.
Every year, Chris?
Yeah, he's
Just
gonna,
one time.
I'm assuming that he'll look at it on an annual basis. He seems to, we have a fairly good relationship with him, so I expect to keep kept in the loop.
I'm the council rep for the library, and that second $5,000, we may need to try to let it go this year, but the point I'm trying to make with that group is that on the interlibrary loan, first of all, should the person that's asking for the product have a little skin in the game
Definitely.
out of $20? And I know that goes against the concept of a public library, so if anybody has a strong opinion about that, let me know.
No, I
But I want to get some traction back from that $5,000.
Yeah.
If the rest of that group is supportive of that. This doesn't even bring up the fact of people that order for interlibrary loans and then don't pick it up.
Yeah.
So you don't want to know that. So that's, I'm going to try to bring that $5,000 back or tighten that up somehow, as long as there's no public backlash about the public library concept, when you have to, you know, I don't know, pay $2, $5, whatever towards your interlibrary request.
Yep.
That's all I have.
Southeast Lynn, I'm sure Stephanie could probably speak more to this, but their major funding source is cutting back, and that's the United Way. And I saw a similar request being made in Lisbon as well, so.
Purely out of curiosity, why are the $2 there? $7,002.
Because it was $12,998 previously, or,
Their previous was $2 shy of 13,000.
yeah.
Actually,
Which,
just-
of course, leads
just
me to another
irritating.
question.
It's
but
been that-
I'm not even going to go down
I have
It's been
no
that
idea.
for years.
All right.
It's been that same amount.
So we're just cleaning that up, fair
But I
enough.
do
Thank
want to
you.
just make a comment on this. My understanding is that United Way, their income of people donating to United Way was cut by 30%. And so they had to make some really strong cuts. I even got a letter, the Boy Scouts were also cut as well. So obviously, the challenge with Southeast Lynn is that with a new executive director and much more visibility in the communities, the need for the services has really gone up. People are using, we served 85 meals at, where people picked up, 85 families picked up food Thanksgiving weekend, and at Christmas it was even more. And it's just amazing how many people are in need of help.
So overall, on those items, it's roughly an increase of 9,000.
$2.
$2.
Thanks, Matt.
Honestly, nothing that I don't think the budget can handle. We had some nice decreases. Again, some of that being passed through, we have some revenue coming back in, so I didn't have any issue with the changes that were made, unless you do. Police, they had one line item that increased by $1,000. The rest of it was all staff driven, so the 15% increase in insurance is the driving force behind their increase. even with a 15% increase in insurance, they were able to keep their increase overall under 5%. Fire, I tried to show you if you take their capital projects out of the mix, and they have a specific levy for fire equipment. They really kind of hovered between 5 and 8%. This is our half. The other half comes from rural fire. So the increases were in the chief's stipends. We just had a fire meeting this past Thursday. That hasn't changed. There are additional requirements being placed on them for training. Even our chief, who trained obviously full-time in Cedar Rapids, still has to go through additional training here with the staff. So it's a changing world. It's not one that's limited to Mount Vernon. Everybody's kind of faced with the same conversation as of late. So questions on those two? Parks and Rec, the pool is always, tends to be kind of our big hang up, and that just depends on Mother Nature. We do have an increase in chemical usage, obviously, with water losses that we talked about previously. Utility costs have gone up slightly. We did, 2 years ago, talk about staff levels and making sure that we try to keep good staff at the pool. So Matt's, I think, hopefully in his last year kind of adjusting to make up for that. So 5.8%, again, it's hard with the pool in there because it kind of skews everything. So questions on that one? Policy and administration, we actually decrease slightly. We continue to make changes based upon decisions or things that are happening at City Hall. The biggest probably being the reliance on legal. I don't talk to Bob often. I have him review ordinances that are coming through beyond that. I don't necessarily bring him in unless I feel like it's necessary. So that's where the biggest decrease has been. If you've seen, I think they were around 70,000. It's gone back down to about 40 now. So those are the general fund budgets for the most part. Streets, Nick continues, and we're going to do this. This will be kind of a common theme through all of these, is that we continue to move numbers where they belong. They used to budget for engineering service fees out of each one. That's how they transferred to cover the cost of the city engineer. So we're moving those, trying to get them located to where they are. The largest increase on streets has been the capital projects, but where we're trying to stick those funds is in capital projects so that we continue to be able to do, crack sealing. Potentially, if we can, we'll do some more seal coat with those funds as opposed to trying to fit those in the CIP. So the estimated revenues for fiscal year 19 are 531. So you can see we're just under, our budget amount is just under what we expect to receive in revenue. Garbage and solid waste. I handed out to you tonight an email that I received today from Wapsie Waste. It's a minor decrease in the actual overall budget. This one kind of fluctuates. There's not a whole lot of wiggle room in it, but we have kind of talked. Last year we extended our contract by 1 year. You can see by that email, obviously Wapsie would like to keep our services. 13 years is a long time to go between trying to put an RFP out there for services, but I have nothing bad to say about Wapsie either. So the question is, most garbage services are typically done in 3 to 5 year increments, just given the cost of the service itself. So at this point, we can continue with Wapsie and renegotiate a 5-year contract, or we can send off RFPs. There are interested groups out there, but they come with changes. Wapsie still does a lot of manual garbage pickup. Most of the other entities do not anymore. They're all manual. I will say that Waste Management has been to my office. They have put kind of an interest out there, good and bad to it. They presented what they kind of do for Ely right now. Larger families would definitely save, potentially. Anybody that has 2 cans would likely save under that model. Recycling probably could increase, just given the fact that it all goes into one recycling container.
Do any of them, and maybe this is a question for an RFP discussion, but you know, one of the things that Tom and I have talked about is composting. Do any of them offer composting options or
No, but I think that's what we're kind of looking for internally.
no?
Marion's at kind of the forefront of composting, at least in the general metro area. And Nick has spent quite a bit of time with their director. So, you know, we continue. We're making progress. Nick and I were just talking about it today. So I really would like to bring the composting internally, along with the LEAF program potentially in the future. So
One other vaguely related question here in this section. What is overall garbage decreased by $929? The corridor plan expense was removed. What is the corridor plan expense?
the bypass plan, out of last year's
Okay.
CIP, we had split that between all of the enterprise funds.
Okay, all right, thank you.
So be thinking about that because that contract is done in June. If you would like staff to pursue opening that up for an RFP, there is at least one individual in town that I would like to bring in and bounce some things off of her before I were to do that. I won't say her name because I don't want to put her on the spot, but I'm sure most of you, she has spoken here before, so.
Everybody knows who you're talking about?
Yeah. So that's really kind of, again, and Tom stopped in my office last week and I just happened to get that from Waste Management. Philosophically, it's different. I mean, some of these other groups are going to bring toters in and you're going to have one big recycling toter and one garbage toter. And the cost will no longer be in the tag system. Obviously, they have information that's going to support their argument that they actually get more recycling out of it with the tote system. But again, I have nothing bad to say about Wapsie Waste either. But like I said, my only point is this 13 years is a long time to go out and test the market.
Competition's good.
So, water increased by 1.81%, which is pretty decent considering it too pays for salaries and some other things, all of which increased much higher than that. So, I try to be fairly careful with water just because of the wastewater or the water treatment plant bond payment that comes out of that. Estimated revenues at $766,400. Estimated expenses are just under that at $765. Sewer, I'm in contact with bond counsel on the Build America bonds. We continue to have this conversation, what seems like every 2 months, to see if it would be smart to put them back on the market, and the date still hasn't been here yet. So in hindsight, that was one program that I wish we would have never gone that. The Build America bonds are taxable bonds, and then the federal government gives us money back for the interest. That money is questionable on a yearly basis though, so. Expenses in sewer are 828, revenues are 828,000 and expenses are 815,000. I did leave $15,000 in that bypass study in case there are additional services that you want to pursue in the next fiscal year. If not, there are other projects that within sewer that can be considered at that time. Stormwater, we've already discussed. It's got a negative balance, so I'm just trying to hold even with it. And then, of course, that goes to the capital projects. So questions on my memo?
No? Well done, good information.
Under the CIP, you see about $2.5 million worth of cuts. Some things have kind of come up, the wagon pass and the First Street Bridge. I've sent information from the engineers to you on both of those. I did not include the quiet zone in the capital projects yet. I'm still trying to get a better handle on what would be required as that. That project can either be $75,000 or it can jump up to $275,000. It just depends on the Union Pacific Road. Dave from B&K contacted me, there's some questions. There is constant warning signals on that portion of the track. They're trying to find locations and whether or not UP is just trying to extend this a little bit or what they're trying to do. So there'll be more on the quiet zone designation, but I did speak at Historic Preservation. Guy Booth was there on Saturday and just kind of filled him in that that project could get more complicated if the cost increases that much. So Elliott Park, this trail is currently listed on here as long as the Nature Park Trail bids this spring come in as expected. We earmarked, I believe, $100,000 in last fiscal year for the Nature Park Trail. Looks like the initial estimates are going to be high, so if there is money available, they would be able to cover the Elliott Park Trail. That $75,000 would come from lost funding for trails. UV disinfection, we will be borrowing for that from the state revolving loan fund. Right now, worst case scenario is $1.6 million. So, the Bobcat police vehicle, utility vehicle, they've all been included in the working budgets.
Back up, can we talk about streetscape?
Yes.
I'm confused as to why that's pulled off when there is lost funding.
There's lost funding
For that.
earmarked, but there's not lost funding available. So
And that's due to the streets projects?
no, so they have a project currently that will be bid this spring.
Okay.
It was part of the last year's CIP.
Oh, that's the South Alley.
The South Alley project is actually more than I think what we expected.
Okay.
We originally had budgeted 100, but it's going to be closer to 150.
Okay.
So all cash, available cash anyway, would go to that project. And then there is a signage group that is going to reach out to the downtown development or the streetscape design committee too. So the other project that was listed was the North Alley, and that one's even more expensive than the South Alley. So if they want to do that one, they'd have to wait a couple of years for sure. In between time, I think some of the business owners downtown would like to talk to that group about other places where that money could be spent. So more to come on that one.
Okay.
Questions on the vehicle purchases? The skid loader is probably the most essential piece of equipment that the Public Works Department has. We have two, and I try to not to buy two in any given year. There is potential that 55,000 number could be reduced. We don't know if our existing skid loader has trade value or not, so the 55,000 would be the worst case scenario. Land acquisition, this is kind of a carryover. We talked about this last fiscal year. Continue to talk about it, but this is what I've earmarked out of solid waste because of the composting portion of the project and the LEAF program. Police software, at this time, I'm leaving it where it's at, hoping that we can get another fiscal year. That's what Doug and I have talked about. We are working on a program that doesn't get supported anymore. So as long as it continues to work, Doug can use it. Should at any time during the fiscal year it not, this project will be back in front of you and we'll have to just figure out how to finance it at that point. So it's a general fund expense. We can finance it, it would just be easier if we could hold off on it. So the community center has its own funding streams right now. I go in front of the Iowa Department of Economic Development on the 14th. So, and then City Hall, those were also included in the budget. Now this is just the security updates. It doesn't provide any of the items down here. One thing that we have talked about is at the end of this fiscal year, if there are individual budgets that would have money available, we could potentially look at making some improvements down here as well and just kind of carrying it over into the next fiscal year as well. So that project will get talked about much more. SCBA fill station, again, that's coming out of fire department's capital improvement levy. It's unlikely that rural fire will have their half, so most likely they're going to pay for it out of that fund. So, and as I've noted, I've sent an email to you previously that we continue. I did meet with the townships last week as well. I thought the conversation went very well. I think we'll spend the rest of the calendar year discussing the potential for it to become just Mount Mervyn Fire, and then they would contract with us. They just can't keep up. Their levy, it doesn't obviously grow to the extent that ours does. So that's the CIP as of right at this moment. The franchise fee, I made some notes down there. Again, not earmarked for anything specific. These are estimates because I haven't gotten our first check yet, so I'm just going based upon what Alliant has estimated for us as far as revenue. So I expect that we'll collect in fiscal year 18 before the end of June, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 20,000. That depends on when their quarters fall, because we get reimbursed every quarter from them. If that holds true, then in fiscal year 19, because the franchise fee goes up every October, part of fiscal year 19 would be at 1%, or a larger portion would be at 3%, so estimating 60 to 70,000, and then same with fiscal year 20, we're not quite to the full 150,000. The 5% would take effect until October of that fiscal year. So I haven't earmarked any of these funds. So when we talk about potential for Elliott Park grading, this is a funding source. Davis Park is another potential. The reason I haven't moved anything back up and talked about franchise fee is because I'm still unsure about the bridge and wagon pass costs, and franchise fees could potentially have to be used for both of those projects. So, being a little conservative, I guess, as far as earmarking too many funds before we know the actual cost of some of these projects. That's my spiel.
Beautiful.
Any questions for Chris? All right, we'll keep on a rolling here. Next item, green space contributions and proposed subdivisions.
Councilperson Christensen talked about this a little bit before, and I don't want to drive the conversation by any means. It was his request to put this on there. Usually the green space discussion, Parks and Rec will look at the master plan. They make their recommendations. So we get a site plan, basically, a rough draft of every subdivision coming in. We send that to all the departments and allow them to review. They make their comments prior to the plat coming forward. One issue, obviously, is especially in Stonebrook, we have 17 acres of green space that are coming on that aren't necessarily considered park. They will be under city ownership. Part of it will be stormwater detention. The one thing that I would say to the council, obviously, is depending on what we decide to do with that, whether or not we plant it in more native vegetation or try to keep it, nice green grass, is staffing. And what we have to do in the summertime to try and keep up with the mowing and such. So, kind of going back to the earlier conversation, I guess the culmination of parkland dedication, at least all of everybody's comments, gets funneled into that preliminary plat when it gets here finally. So everybody has their opportunity, and they talk, through that process, and then those notes or changes are made to the preliminary plat that finally make their way here. The only individual report that ever gets done is what my letter of report would be. That kind of highlights all of the areas or the responses from all of those groups that goes to P&Z and then the city council.
So the reason why I wanted to have this discussion, and I apologize for kind of starting into it before, but there were two other agenda items that related to park ground. So it might feel like we've already talked about this, but just at 50,000 feet, right? So what I'm thinking about is developers have an obligation to give you something. As Chris said, they might want to give you more. Well, that sounds great, free green space. And then the next question is, well, how are we going to use it, and what is the additional capital investment that it takes to get any actual, planned value out of it, right? A piece of land is worth almost nothing except an obligation to take care of it, right? Unless you figured out how you're going to use it, and that might take additional investment. And then beyond that, what's the recurring cost implication of those things that, face value, oh, it's like free horse, right? So I just felt like it would be worthwhile for council to understand for each of the green space contributions currently anticipated and discussed, probably in depth and completely appropriately in the context of Parks and Rec Board membership or leadership with city staff and the developers, et cetera. At what point does council have the opportunity to weigh in from the perspective of, and then we need to come up with this much money to make it have the desired intended purpose, and so we need to plan for that, and then that's going to require us to do a lot more mowing, so then we have these recurring cost considerations and other, because sometimes you might just say, you know what, actually our green space to per capita ratio is super good, and we believe that that's a positive thing for the community, and we're willing to invest in that, but maybe enough is too much. And so, the first reason that I think about this a little more critically is the whole Stonebrook first drainage way contribution thing. It's like, I don't mean to speak poorly of our predecessors, but we were so happy to have somebody, the Stoner family, come in and decide to build all these houses. And just, lots of smiling and nodding and handshaking and accepted whatever. And then what we ended up with was a very expensive green space in the way of a waterway, an overground stormwater system that doesn't really provide us any value as a recreational space. But it was expensive from a capital perspective to make it just not have the neighbors angry because their yards were flooding, et cetera. And so, having been through that bad experience, I was here on the cleanup, like trying to recover from people not asking enough questions and scrutinizing enough. And so that's why I feel like here we are with these two big developments in play. Why don't we as a council participate in conversations that examine the impact of green space in its entirety? And thus my request for the agenda.
Sure, and I think I can shed some light on, just to give you some history on how we ended up with all the green space on both of these subdivision plats. I'll start with Skogman because it's easier. The conversation on the Elliott park extension came about because there was a memo on my desk when I came about stating that we weren't gonna buy it at this time, we were gonna wait to see how it developed out. Meaning, we didn't wanna pay for Elliott Park at the time, we would wait to see if somebody were to step forward and develop that area. 5% is what they're required to set aside. We do have the ability in that 5% set aside as far as not getting the worst ground possible. So we have the ability to kind of negotiate that as we're looking at the plat, but we always try to be mindful that both sides should end up winning in that scenario. So you can tell the difference typically with the neighborhood park because you won't see a parking lot that goes along with the construction. And the reason for that is you're not trying to get people necessarily to drive to that location, but you do try to connect them with, you know, a trail system or a sidewalk system that people can still utilize that trail network. And that's why you see the one kind of dead center of Spring Meadow Heights is their 5%, kind of this elongated park. Now granted, it's a selling feature for them as well. Anybody that has a house that backs up to that extra green space and doesn't have a neighbor right behind them, they're likely going to be able to charge a little bit more for those homes. At the same time, it does give us a neighborhood park on the east half of the community. Elliott was already established as somewhat of a destination park. The difficult part with Elliott at the time was the developer is responsible for the stormwater that their development creates. They are not responsible for the stormwater that is basically funneled through their development, which is the case here in Spring Meadow Heights. So all the issues majority of the issues that we're having on the west side of Highway 1 stem from water coming from both, well, basically all directions because it's a basin down there. Slowing the water down from the east was a major component, at least from a conversation standpoint for staff. And that's why you see that rather large, kind of odd-looking detention basin, green space, kind of this massive, almost triangular rhombus that's going on. Because we require them to upscale or upsize the stormwater detention to slow that water coming from the farm field to the other side of where this development would be. Right now, our detention is Elliott. So there's a small berm where the two outfields meet, and that tends to